Hi, this is Ken and
Kenny
with Just Disciple, and in this segment we are going to talk about different types of discipleship models, okay?
Yeah.
There are a lot of different discipleship models out there. Today we're going to focus on three predominant ones that different churches use. There's a lot of pros and cons to each one, so we're not going to hit on every single pro and con, but we're going to hit on some of them. But before we get into the discipleship models, there are sometimes churches or parachurches, depending on what you got going on, that have an approach, right? Sometimes it's more of an organic approach to discipleship. And this isn't really a model, but what ends up happening is they're just like, hey, let's see what happens if I'm just slightly intentional with these people. The pro to that approach is that it doesn't feel forced, right? You all of a sudden, if Kenny, you started to approach me, you started to hang out with me, and you're just being pretty intentional with my life, I feel like you really want to invest in me. It feels authentic, right?
Right.
It feels like you really want to invest in my life.
And what you're saying really is, when you go to a church and you say, "Hey, what's your model for discipleship?"
Yeah.
They may respond to you and say, "Oh, we don't have a model. We just love each other and we hang out and we just love Jesus together and we just mentor people." And there's not really an official model per se because it's all organic, it's all informal. But in essence, that becomes a model.
Yeah.
And as you said, there's some pros to that,
Yep.
to some extent, right? People feel included, but there are some cons to that as well, right? What are maybe some of the things that go awry?
I think one of the biggest cons is that sometimes discipleship just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Because you expect that there are certain things that should happen in discipleship, and we talked about this in other videos of what is discipleship, the process of discipleship, right? And there's certain things that should happen within each phase of discipleship that may not happen if there isn't a process that you have set in place of what you hope individuals should be going through. So discipleship just may not end up happening. Another thing that could happen is just people might get left out, because you, Kenny, might focus on like these 3 or 4 people here in your church, but what about Sally or Billy in the corner over there that just keeps coming to your church and just kind of get left out? So making sure that doesn't happen, because you're just hoping, someone's going to reach out to them. Well, at some point, no one's going to reach out to them, and they just leave your church and try to find something else.
Yeah, and I think the best example I've ever heard about why we basically need a discipleship model is the idea, imagine you have a potluck, and then you just go, okay, everyone's going to bring food, and eventually we'll have enough food. What if everyone brings corn on the cob? And now you've got a big table full of corn on the cob. You need some element of strategy. Okay, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then collectively we have an entire meal.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the best approach. If you just assume it's going to happen informally or kind of accidentally, it might happen, but not likely. Yeah. The other biggest con, I think, that's the reality is we live in a very segmented society. Now, if you live in parts of Latin America or the Eastern world, this is not the case. But for those of us who live in the Western world, particularly North America, we're very segmented. Before the Industrial Revolution, most men and women worked in the home. They worked the farm or they worked the shop that they owned. And they spent the time with their neighbors. Before the advent of the automobile, you only went as far as you could walk or as far as your horse could walk. You didn't go very far. And so there was a lot more natural overlap. So if you went to church typically within a few minutes from where you lived, if not a few hundred feet. And therefore you naturally met people and you knew people. Well, now, in a society where we work mostly outside of the home, we spend the bulk of our day away from our family, we spend the bulk of our day away from our church family, and we don't really see our church family when we organize things because our life is so segmented. The idea that things are going to happen accidentally or unintentionally, I just think simply is unrealistic.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, part of the organic, one of the pros could be that if you live in a society where there's natural overlap, it could work out really well.
Right.
But when there isn't, we have to be really intentional, really focused. And that's where these discipleship models kick in. Right? So the first discipleship model that I think we could talk about is the life-on-life discipleship model. Kenny, when we talk about life-on-life discipleship model, what do we refer to that?
I heard a guy who was a part of Young Life many years ago basically said, our goal is to get people to hang out with each other and just live life together. So whatever I'm doing, you're doing it with me. Whatever you're doing, I'm doing it with you. We're just friends. Yeah. That's all really. Mark Dever, pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist Church in D.C., he says, discipleship is nothing more than Christ-centered friendship. So life on life is the idea of let's deploy a model or a structure that forces people to basically hang out with one another in hopes that they will develop friendships that are Christ-centered. That's really life on life. Let's force people to hang out, and let's hope that they develop a relationship that will be mutually beneficial to them as they seek to love Jesus better. That's in essence what the life on life model is. And it looks a couple different ways. There's kind of two broad categories. One's kind of the small group model, and then one's kind of the mentorship roster, like the Young Life model.
Yeah.
So Young Life would say, and I know churches do this, nonprofits do this, universities do this, parachurch organizations, they'll say, okay, we got 50 people. Ken, you take these. Hey, Dan, you take these. Hey, Billy, you take these. Hey, Sally, you take these. Hey, Mackenzie, you take these. And basically our roster is covered, and you're responsible to go hang out all these people. And that's kind of, they split it up, kind of a divide and conquer type of idea. Or a life-on-life model may look like small groups, where in a lot of this is the most popular model in America today with churches. Every Tuesday night we're going to have a small group, or a missional community, or a Elevate group, or a Cell group, or whatever the many names that come up, right? But all these different types of groups that exist, they really the idea is and they usually meet in homes, right? Most of the time, the idea is get people together where they're going to build relationships and do life on life. And recognizing that, hey, if we do small group at our house together every Tuesday night, the hope is it goes beyond that. The hope is just to stop on Tuesday. But we build friendships. So now, hey, we're going to go hang out and grab coffee on a Saturday morning, or we're going to go on vacation together, or we're going to go double date together, whatever it may be. You with a woman, not double date. But
no, that's a different
right. So the idea of like, that's the life on life ideology. So that kind of, there's a lot of different types of small groups. So what are the different types that exist? I know.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are simply like a book based or sermon based.
You're reading through a book together.
Yeah, you're reading through a book together, or you're going through either a sermon that your church has done or whatever.
Right. We do that at my church, right?
Yeah.
Preacher preaches on Sunday, and then Tuesday night we're going through questions, discussing the content from the sermon.
Yeah. Some people also do just books of the Bible, so it's a little bit more specific. Sometimes people do, here's this Tim Keller book, right? Or actually go through a book of the Bible. You're going to go through Judges, right? Another one is interest groups. So you might have certain interests, and that could spear off to...
Right. We're all CrossFitters. We love knitting together, so we're going to all knit together and do a small group around knitting.
That'd be awesome. The other one would be geography, just location. Like, hey, we're 5 minutes away from each other. It works out really well. And the other two could be like missions focused or ministry team focused, right? Like there's a specific mission that you have that you're really passionate about. So it might be like feeding the poor. That's like your mission. That's your jam. You're like, this is what the Lord's called me to. And you find other people who are interested in that particular sphere of mission or ministry. So those are the types of small groups that are out there. With that being said, there are some pros to this life on life, right? One of the biggest pros is that it brings intentional community, where because we live in a society that can be busy and you have a lot of things going on, it's important to just focus on like, hey, I'm going to make some time to be really intentional with a community that's going to be Christ honoring, God glorifying, and ultimately we are pushing each other to look more like Christ. So that's the beauty of the intentional community. The other thing too is that you feel like progress is being made, right? Like as you're doing the small group, you're going through books of the Bible, you get to know each other. You're like, wow, I am growing, and you see your growth and the growth of the other person. So you see the tangible progress being made within each individual.
Yeah, as a pastor, one of my biggest goals is to get people coming into my church and meeting other people who are already part of that community. Lifeway's got some great stats where they say, if a person has at least 7 friendships within a local congregation, the chances of them ever leaving that church is virtually 0%, unless something major happens. So our goal is one beyond that. Can I get you, as a new person in our church, can I get you to develop 8 quality friendships with people in that community that I know that you're never going to leave? And again, it's not about me getting them in my church. I just want them in Christ-honoring friendships that are going to be really helpful to them on the long term. And a community group or a small group or a life group, whatever you call it, gets you really down the road with that goal. If I can get you in a room with 10 other people who love Jesus, who are already committed to the church, I get you in that room, now I'm way down the road in potentially getting you to the point where now you build friendships. Doesn't guarantee it for sure. And we know it fails in a lot of contexts, but at minimum, it gets you way down the road, and it feels like there's progress happening.
Well, and I think the important part is that it also reminds us that like discipleship is not just based on me as a pastor or an elder helping disciple this one person. It's all of us working together to help us mature as the body of Christ. So it lessens the responsibility on us, and it'd be like we're all in this together.
Yeah, that's good.
With that in mind, though, what are some cons? I mean, there's more pros, but what are some cons?
The biggest one, it just feels forced.
Yeah.
Like now I'm supposed to be a good Christian, so I'm supposed to go to small group on Wednesday night, and now I'm in a room with 12 other people that I don't know. I may not feel comfortable connecting with them. There may be all sorts of things. Maybe I'm not comfortable with opening up. There could be all sorts of reasons why this feels awkward and goofy. And many of us, I think, have been there. We've been in that moment where it's like, I know there's one person talking way too much. Usually that's me. But then there's that one person talking way too much. It just gets awkward. It gets goofy. It feels forced. It doesn't feel organic. So now it feels like I'm forced to be friends. What if I don't even like these people? I know that sounds awful to say out loud, but we're all thinking it, right? So I think it's clunky. I don't know that there's a good solve to that in most scenarios, but it's something that we have to face, and we have to at least make an attempt to navigate.
Yeah, and part of the reason why that's clunky is because one of the pros to Life on Life or small groups is that when it works, you feel known.
Yeah.
Right? Like you love to feel known, you're excited, you're like, wow, people know who I am, they know all my sin, they know how my strengths, they know everything about me, and I am accepted for who I am.
Yeah.
But when you're in an interpersonal connection with people that feels manufactured, when you're in a group that feels like personality conflicts hit, you tend to wall up, right? You tend to bring up defenses, and you're like, now I don't feel known, right? So that's kind of the con. I think another con also is that it sometimes can feel like another thing to do on the to-do list.
Right.
Right? Where
I think it's a big one.
It does feel like a big one where like, man, and this is our society, and this is a whole different topic in general, but like, if you think about your general day where if you're married and all of a sudden you have kids, you got small group one day, then you have date night another day, and then you have, basketball practice for one of your kids or whatever sport activity. Maybe 3 or 4 days out of the week, all of a sudden it just feels just a lot like crammed into your schedule. Then you got like maybe one day to do certain things, with your family. Mm-hmm. It just feels like a lot. So then this just feels like another thing to do. You go to small group, you go do these mentorship strategies, and ultimately you're just kind of like, man, I'm just going through the rhythms and just doing it off the checklist.
Yeah. And so I think one of the biggest things is it's to help people see the value in that, and to make sure when you deploy this model in your church, that it actually is valuable to people. Because otherwise, if it's just another thing to do, I got to take my kid to youth group on Wednesday, and I got to take my kid to baseball practice on Thursday, and then I got to take my daughter to ballet on Saturday. Like, it becomes another thing to do. Eventually, people are going to go, let's just can the whole small group thing. That extra night a week would just be really helpful to us. Yeah. So whenever you're going to deploy that, just make sure you're thinking about that, and make sure it really is valuable. But I think ultimately, the discipleship model around Life on Life, let's get people in our churches or in our organization, meeting other people, and actually hanging out, is extremely valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the first discipleship model that's being employed throughout most of America, I would assume, right?
We spend the most amount of time on that one because that is the most prominent one.
Which is the big thing today in our culture. The second one is family emphasis, okay? And what we mean by family emphasis in this model is that the whole church, the elders, the pastors, their focus is on the family unit. How do we develop the family unit to have the discipleship happening within the homes? And that's where everything is going on, right? So some of the pros within the family emphasis is that we've realized through statistics that family discipleship is the most effective discipleship.
Far and away.
Far and away. Anything that happens when you get a young individual, right, a child, being grown within a godly family, they are more likely to stay within the Christianity and see the glories of Christ, right? That's just the realities of it. And also, just one of the pros of it is that it has the best reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church. When you see the parents model just the beauty of love within their relationship, the mutual submission, the mutual care for one another, and then how they treat the child, and you see it happening on day-to-day real life, right? All of a sudden you're like, man, what's going on within this family that they have something different, and that thing that's different is Christ, right? And that's the beauty of the family emphasis model. Yeah,
and just to make sure people are tracking, when we say family emphasis as a discipleship model, what we're really saying is that a church or organization saying our means for discipling our people is really doing things that help local families so that they can actually do the mentorship. That we as a church are not going to attempt to do the mentorship, or we're going to attempt to do very little of it, and that our primary focus is coming alongside local families, fathers, mothers, and really equipping them, training them to then disciple their children, right, primarily, and then mother and father, husband and wife, to then mutually, edifying one another, mutually submitting to one another. Certainly, we believe, as the Bible is very clear, men are called to be the shepherds of their home, to really reflect God in their home. And so they are the primary pastors, but men, husband and wife together, mutually edify one another, and then together disciple their children. So that's really the idea of that. And as you said, if we can get parents to actually do this we're going to hit home runs, metaphorically speaking, in our discipleship efforts.
Yeah. I mean, one of the beauties, I know I've seen it when I see a father, right, with their kid and throughout the years just like develop and disciple their kid. And I'm watching him and I'm seeing him, and I'm just amazed by how much the son just loves his father. And he's like, I wouldn't be saved and I wouldn't be a believer if it wasn't for my dad. Right? Like how pivotal, how important it is for fathers to be there discipling their children. And that's the beauty of the family emphasis model, is that if you have fathers who are proactive and diligent in discipling, man, the children become very godly. And that's not like a thus saith the Lord, right? But practicality, it happens where...
Statistically speaking.
Yeah.
Right.
People are just, by far, children feel like there's a long-lasting impact in their lives when they have godly fathers there discipling their children.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my life in youth ministry. The kids that come from godly families have a dramatic spiritual head start, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, there's some potential pitfalls to this. If you're a local church focusing primarily on equipping and training mothers and fathers, fathers to be pastors at their home, mothers and fathers to work together to train their children. If that becomes all you do, the major pitfalls are what?
I mean, one of the biggest things is what happens if parents are not saved.
Yeah.
Right?
Or very spiritually immature.
Yeah. Or just single parent families, right?
Big one.
Big one, where right now in our generation, 40% are growing up as a fatherless generation. Now that doesn't mean that you as a single parent cannot lovingly shepherd your children and that God cannot use you. That's absolutely important. But when it comes to the family emphasis model, it's kind of contingent on both parents being there.
It's much harder to do with one parent.
Yeah, it's much harder. So realizing that if one of the parents is out of the picture, whether it's not saved or immature or just passive, it becomes really difficult to maneuver this this model.
Yeah, you also have a couple other things. What happens with singles in your church?
Yeah.
What happens to those people maybe who are widows? Is there no discipleship efforts for them? What happens to them? What about unsaved teenagers or children that don't come from Christian homes, so they're coming to church on their own? How do you disciple them? And I've seen some churches basically say families and households should adopt singles and adopt widows and adopt children. So you end up having family devotionals on a regular basis with a few extra people that are not quite biological family.
Yeah.
But then you almost then begin to teeter into the community group model to some extent. So it's not a bad model. And I think every church should be doing family ministry discipleship efforts. But it should not be the only thing we rely upon, because I think there's some pitfalls that potentially come up there.
Yeah. And then there's one last model. So far we got life on life, then we got family emphasis, and then we got the classroom setting. Kenny, hit us or talk to us a little bit about the classroom setting.
Classroom setting is kind of the real traditional Sunday school model would fall into the classroom setting. This is basically when you take any sort of formal classroom or more academic training program. Churches, they have a local Bible institute in their local church, or Mark Devereaux, I've alluded to earlier, in his church, Capitol Hill Baptist, they do these things called equipping classes, where people can take them. Basically, they're Sunday school classes. Before the small group model exploded in the 1970s and early 80s, because it's a very recent thing, before small groups became a really powerful and prominent model, Sunday school was a thing in our country for over 100 years. D.L. Moody, the famous 19th century preacher, really took the idea of Sunday school, which was actual Sunday school for children, they were actually learning literacy and things, and he said, let's make this into Christian education. And it exploded in Chicago and then beyond that. And it was very effective for over 100 years. We actually just started it at our local church here in the Twin Cities for adults. We had not had Sunday school for the first 4 years of our existence. And I'm telling you, we're a few weeks in, and it is a smashing success. And so I know it sounds kind of old school, but really Sunday school.
Yeah.
Some people do this on a Tuesday night where they do I know a church who does finance class or a parenting class, or I saw a church that they had an Enneagram class, how to use the Enneagram in your spiritual growth. You basically you have like basically just any sort of official classroom setting, and this could look all different types of ways. But the most prominent was the traditional Sunday school model.
Yeah, and the beauty of that is that as you're doing that, you could get a lot of good teaching to a lot of good people in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Right? That's the pro of this, is that you know for sure if this amount of people went through it, all of a sudden you're like, yep, they got the teaching and they got what I as a pastor or the elders expect from the teaching to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and we want everyone to go through particular classes. So we basically launched this adult Sunday school class. We basically said anyone who becomes a member from here on out, as our church has grown numerically, we know that the original group got what we wanted them to get, discipleship-wise. But as we get bigger and we grow at a fast rate, it's not happening. So we basically said from here on out, everyone who becomes a member, you're required to go through this class within a year of becoming a member. And we're starting the dialogue here, the different types of Sunday school classes or equipping classes we're going to offer periodically. So we do things like on a Friday night, we had a mental health specialist come in and go, how should Christians deal with mental health? That was our Friday night equipping. And we want all of our members to go through that at least once at some point in their life.
Yeah.
Maybe not every time, but we want. So those are the types of things we're thinking about. That's more formalized. It's more academic. It's a little more structured, and it helps us to do that. And I think the other major pro it gives us, not just bringing in experts, but it also gives us opportunities to give some guys opportunities to preach and teach that otherwise might not have the opportunity to preach and teach. And we may not want to give a particular newer teacher preacher a Sunday morning pulpit. That might be a big deal. But maybe we give them a Sunday school class, and we can try them out. Paul makes it very clear, we don't put someone into an overseer office unless we know that they're a good teacher. Well, how are you going to know if they're a good teacher
if they've never taught?
If they've never taught. You got to give them an opportunity and evaluate them and coach them and train them and kind of raise them up. And so I think that's a really big win that a lot of people don't realize how valuable that can be to a local church.
Yeah, absolutely. With all that being said, there is a big con to the classroom setting, is that sometimes it can feel a little bit overly academic.
Yeah, a little nerdy.
A little nerdy, depending on where you go, right? Some classroom settings may not be academic at all, right? It's just kind of like you're just going through a random book study all the time. But for the most part, people who have done this type of model, it can just be overly academic, overly just like nerdy, like you mentioned. And then that ends up happening like, I'm just going to another class. Especially if you just went to Sunday school and then you got to go listen to a sermon that might be a little bit more academically oriented. You're like, okay.
I feel like I just heard two sermons. I went to church twice.
Right. You just went to church twice, and now you're like, okay, good. So then what ends up happening is because it's very academic, you might not actually get the community or the relationship that is desired because you're just going in, taking notes, leaving. Right? Yeah. But those are some of the cons. That being said, we've talked about three major discipleship models. We have the life on life, the family emphasis, and the classroom setting. With all that, right, as a church, as a university or parachurch, whatever you're following, whatever model you're in, you have to decide what is best within your context.
Yeah, and I would argue that all three of these should be in play.
Yeah.
That every local church should have all three of these. Every faith-based organization should be seeking to utilize all three of these in one way or another. But as you said, you're going to determine which one you lean on more than others. And I think that's going to be your context, your people, personalities, what skills you have within your organization. All of these are important, but based on your organization, your context, or what season of life your church happens to be in, that will maybe dictate which one of these you lean on more than the others.
Yeah. So with that, that is our video on discipleship models. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, leave a comment and we'll get back to you. Hope you guys have a great day and God bless.